Hello, my name is Russell Myers, independent for U.S. President for 2024. So, in the past few weeks, we have again seen an uprise in the number of mass shootings in this country. Dozens of Americans have been killed, scores others injured. We've seen shootings just recently at a grocery store, a hospital, and most tragically, a school. Every time we see mass shootings, we see the gun lobby and gun owners spastically making desperate claims and becoming mindlessly aggressive, crying for more armed officers and even armed civilian volunteers at schools. If they really have their way, what we will wind up with is martial law in this country. If you have armed volunteers at schools, who certifies the volunteers that they are safe? You just see somebody come up with a gun and assume that they're the good guy? That it doesn't work that way. In some past cases, armed civilians have patrolled schools for a few weeks, then they disappear. So that is not a solution to the problem. And how do you think children would feel about seeing all these armed people walking around in their schools? Do you think that's going to make them feel safer? No, it won't. All right, in the recent school shooting, 19 students and 2 teachers were killed, while 17 others were injured by the shooter. Claims that we need armed police in schools do not offer a solution. There was an armed officer at the school in Uvalde at the time of the shooting, from my understanding. He watched the shooter enter the school, sat down outside, and waited for backup. At least 40 officers arrived, all armed, some carrying AR-15s, all wearing ballistic vests. They wandered around outside the school for over an hour, handcuffing and tasing parents who tried to enter the school to extract their children. This is not the first time that an armed officer or civilian was present before a shooting began. In Parkland, Florida, there was an armed officer at the school at the time of the shooting. That officer left the building and waited outside while children were being shot. I want you to try and imagine your own child in a school facing such a shooter, looking down the barrel of an assault weapon aimed directly at your child's face. I want you to imagine the terror which goes through that child's mind, your child's mind, the desperate wish to be with you for comfort and protection, and that is the very last thing they ever experience. Imagine what the occupants of the grocery store experienced when a shooter entered the store and began killing them. This was a shooter who specifically targeted a grocery store with a primarily black clientele, miles from his own home. That shooter had openly embraced neo-Nazi ideology and wore the emblem of the black sun, a Nazi symbol which is used by the Azov division in Ukraine, whom he had strongly identified with. A few years ago, there was a scare of a possible shooter at St. Mary's University in Texas. The university went on lockdown. There wound up being no shooter, but there were a number of civilians who held concealed carry permits and were armed at the time of the event. Every one of them, without exception, hid until they were given the announcement that all was clear. NRA propaganda tries to convince people that the discussion on stricter gun laws is an intent to completely disarm the public. Most Americans know that this is not what is being discussed. But the mindless, brainwashed few, led by the NRA, are the loudest and most animalistically aggressive. They account for a small percentage of the population. What most Americans do not seem to understand is that the NRA is nothing more than a marketing organization for gun manufacturers. Every time there is a mass shooting reported in the national media, firearm sales escalate drastically. Assault weapons account for only a small percentage of firearm sales in the United States, and most gun owners have no desire to own an assault weapon. Yet, because firearm sales skyrocket with each mass shooting, it becomes abundantly clear that weapons manufacturers have absolutely no desire to see another assault weapons ban put in place. Even if the increased sales are not of assault weapons, they profit from each shooting. This also makes it excessively clear that gun manufacturers have no sorrow regarding the deaths of children and unarmed civilian adults. In fact, they revel in the knowledge that they will make money from each of these events. The arguments regarding gun ownership and the political grandstanding regarding stricter gun laws are the exact same cycle we suffer through with every mass shooting, no exceptions. Let's make a few things clear here. No, the Second Amendment does not allow you to own any weapon of your choice without limitations. We once had an assault weapons ban in this country. You cannot legally possess bombs of any description, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, or biological weapons. These are all arms. Assault weapons are not defensive weapons. They are offensive devices, hence the very term assault weapon. Assault is an offensive action, not defensive. Some people like to make some claim of owning assault weapons for self-defense. If you feel you need a long-range, military configuration, high-velocity weapon with a 30-round magazine, your concern is not for self-defense. You will not be defending yourself from a person that is half a mile away. If you need 30 rounds to defend yourself, you should not be handling a firearm. If you hit your target once out of those 30 rounds, the 29 other rounds you fired may well pose a higher risk than your aggressor does. The majority of Americans support stronger common sense gun laws, including a complete ban on assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, and more extensive background checks. The argument always comes up that if guns are outlawed, only criminals will have guns. Yet the fact of the matter is that nearly every mass shooter obtained their gun legally. This includes the recent school shooter in Uvalde, Texas, the shooter at the New York grocery store, the Parkland school shooter, and the shooter at Sandy Hook. Another thing we see with each mass shooting is the political posturing by Congress and the president for something to be done. Then they do nothing except cash the checks for campaign donations from gun manufacturers. Oddly, Trump did marginally more for gun safety than Obama did by imposing a ban on bump stocks. But those are not typically, produced commercially. Not by large gun manufacturers anyway. They are aftermarket. So what is my policy proposal regarding this issue, and how would I go about actually doing something about this problem? I propose the same policy proposals which have been suggested in the past. A complete assault weapons ban. There could be exceptions for licensed collectors and museums as long as their weapons are disabled and securely stored with that storage inspected. Complete ban on high-capacity magazines. No exceptions allowed, including for collectors or museums. Complete ban. Temporary seizure of weapons for those legally charged with violent crimes or deemed an acute suicide risk. Weapons could be returned to the owner after they are legally and or psychiatrically cleared of being a threat to themselves or others. A hard limitation on the number of firearms any individual can own. Exceptions can be made for licensed collectors, dealers, and museums. Certified safety and accuracy training and testing for all gun owners with repeat testing at specified intervals. This would have to be done for each individual weapon owned, as every weapon handles and operates differently. Testing facilities and those performing testing would have to be federally certified themselves with intermittent, unannounced inspections and document reviews, along with undercover students to check for ethical practice. Liability insurance for each gun owned. More stringent background checks for all gun sales. No exceptions for gun shows or private sales. These are all very sane steps which could be taken to help reduce the risk of gun violence, at least as far as mass shooters are concerned. They are proposals which have been in existence for decades, yet have never been acted upon. Unfortunately, these things cannot be passed by executive order. So how would I go about enacting such a policy? The same way I would enact many other policies. One president after another has claimed an inability to act, stating that Congress must act. Yet no president has tried forcing Congress to take such action. Really takes the teeth out of any tough on crime claims, doesn't it? No, I would mandate Congress to enact such common sense gun laws. Then I would force them to do it. It's really not that hard for a president to force Congress to act. All the president has to do is announce an emergency session of Congress. Every member of Congress would have to be physically present and would not be allowed to leave until legislation is passed. I would refuse to sign any other legislation presented to me until that legislation is passed. Exceptions for anything which involved human rights, of course. I would make extensive use of the line item veto in the federal budget. I don't get what I want, they don't get what they want. Would this be sufficient to completely stop mass shootings? Most likely not. but it would reduce the number of mass shootings by a large margin. Nearly every mass shooting we have seen has involved assault weapons with high-capacity magazines. So it is very obvious that there is a mental equivalency between assault weapons and mass shootings. While I propose universal health care, which would include mental health coverage, that is not sufficient, because a person would have to either actively seek such help or be forced by a court to obtain such assistance. Most shooters will not seek assistance, believing themselves to be sane and superior, while they see their victims to be deficient in some way. It takes fairly extreme circumstances before a court can order psychiatric evaluation or treatment. As president, I would absolutely refuse to stand by while children and innocent civilians are slaughtered or severely injured. This is an issue which mandates action, and we are well beyond the point where that should be a mandate. Please share this article or video. Talk about these subjects. If you can afford it, please donate whatever you can to help support the campaign. Thank you for reading or watching, and I hope you have a good day.